Good afternoon, National Museum of American History and Smithsonian colleagues, and welcome to another presentation of the Smithsonian Staff Learning Series, where we explore the trends, topics, and research relating to the public so that we may better understand our current and future audiences. My name is Adam Rozan. I'm the Director of Programs and Audience Development at the National Museum of American History. Like many in this series, today's talk draws inspiration from the work happening in American history and elsewhere across the Smithsonian, with important projects like the exhibition Rallying Against Racism, which displays the San Francisco Chinatown banner carried by rally goers early on in the pandemic, which its English portion reads, "Fight the virus, not the people." Now, let me introduce you to our speaker for today, Dr. Russell Jeung from the Stop AAPI Hate Organization and of San Francisco State University. Russell is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and the author of several books and articles on race and religion, including Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, and Mountain Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, among other works. In March 2020, he co-founded Stop AAPI Hate with the Chinese for Affirmative Action and the AAPI Equity Alliance. The group tracks incidents of COVID-19 discrimination to develop policy interventions and long-term solutions to racism. The Stop AAPI Hate organization was awarded the 2021 Webby Award for Social Movement of the Year. Our speaker has been named as one of the Time magazine's 100 most influential persons and the Bloomberg 50 and the Political 40 most impactful persons. The Asia Society honored him with a Game Changer Award in 2022. As you listen to today's talk, please think about what questions, ideas, or insights that you can bring back to your colleagues and the projects that you're working on here at the Smithsonian. Please note that this discussion is being recorded with closed captioning, and I'll be helping our speaker by moderating the chat, so please add your questions there. I will also share links to some upcoming talks as well. And lastly, I'd like to thank Curator Theo Gonzalez for his help with today's discussion and welcome students from Russell Young's class who will be joining us for this hour. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Russell Jeung.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you, Smithsonian, for inviting me today. I was actually able to help get that banner from Chinatown, San Francisco to the Smithsonian, and I know that the Chinatown folks were really excited to be have that banner exhibited by the Smithsonian and to be recognized as part of the American historical experience. So thank you for letting my students join too. So this is a combination of both San Francisco State students in my class and Smithsonian staffers. Today I'm going to talk about the yellow peril racism, its past, present, and future. And I think that the racism that Asian Americans are facing now during the pandemic is pretty distinct, yet really historic in nature and a repeat of history. So when we heard that COVID was coming from China, I knew, because I teach Asian American history, that Asians would be blamed for that disease and face racist violence and racist policies. And so we created Stop AAPI Hate. And I want to tell you why we knew that this surge of racism was occurring by just going over some of the history of Asian Americans for you and the particular distinctions of the yellow peril racism. So this is what I'll be talking about today, how the yellow peril stereotype has affected health policy historically, how it now racializes Asian Americans, how the yellow peril has impacted Asian Americans today, and then how we can resist it. So to start, you see a picture on the right of Fu Manchu. And for my own personal experience, we only have two photos of my grandfather, my maternal grandmother. And one is his wedding photo. But the other is a Hollywood still of my grandfather. He left Oakland in 1926 and moved to LA specifically to be in the movies. It's sort of interesting, right? How often do you think of Asian Americans going to Hollywood? But he wasn't seeking to be a star. The only real easy work for Chinese back then was to be an extra. So, so the second photo of my grandfather is one of him that he used, I guess, for his Hollywood work. And for me, I don't, we lost that picture for a period. And so I recall that photo of him as Fu Manchu. And so I pictured him like this character. Fu Manchu was a really popular movie series. They made 15 movies, 12 to 15 movies of Fu Manchu. And they were similar in that Fu Manchu was bent on world domination. He was evil, yet the Yellow Peril incarnate, they called him. He had 4 degrees from both Eastern universities and Western universities. And so he was actually supposed to be a mixed race character. So the great fear of Fu Manchu was that he combined the technologies of the East with the learning of the West to, again, conquer the world. The other fear about Fu Manchu was that he would unite oppressed peoples of Asia and Africa against Europeans and the colonizers. And so the fear of his use of Eastern and Western technologies, the fear that he would draw together the East to unite against the West was all part of the storyline. So years later, we found the photo again, and this is the actual photo. So you can see my imagination of my grandfather was totally off. He wasn't Fu Manchu, but another Chinese character. And that just goes to show you that how popular representations, how media representations really shape how we think about others, how we feel about others, how I felt about my own family even. So this photo of my grandfather here, he's obviously in the center, is not of an evil Fu Manchu, but another stereotype about Chinese. And I think it does, though, sort of reflect the Orientalism of the time. Orientalism, as written by Edward Said, is the way the East is depicted by the West. So while the West sees itself as progressive, you could see here the white women are in modern dress, the East is seen as traditional, and you see my grandfather in a gown. Whereas the West is seen as rational, the East is seen as irrational and superstitious. Whereas the West is seen as normal, the East is seen as exotic and foreign. Whereas the East is normal, whereas the West is normal, the East is inscrutable. We have these screens in the back so that you could see the front of Asians, but you don't know what's going on behind in their minds. So in this notion of Orientalism that's depicted by my grandfather, the East is the opposite of the West. It's how the West portrays the East in academia, in museums, in literature, in movies. But Said also says that even though Orientalism is how the East is depicted, Orientalism is also about how the West sees itself, that the West derives its identity by distancing itself from the East, right? And so that's why the West can see itself as modern, progressive, normal. And so this notion of Orientalism extends to the Yellow Peril in how we understand Asians in the past and how we understand Asians today. And here is Nicolas Cage in the more recent depiction of Fu Manchu. The other depiction of Fu Manchu is in Shang-Chi's Marvel series. They have a character named the Mandarin who's also bent on world domination. So the Yellow Peril overall is a stereotype that Asians are an existential threat to the West. that they'll come from the east with their hordes of people, with their disease-ridden bodies, and invade the West and conquer them. That was the fear. This fear went as far back as Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun. And in the 19th century, Kaiser Wilhelm actually had a dream about the yellow peril. And his dream was that the East would come, or especially Japanese, would come from the East and overcome the West. And so he actually had this painting reproduced where European nations represented here under the cross needed to unite lest they be conquered by the East. And he actually reprinted this lithograph and sent it to other leaders like the King of Prussia, England, to warn them that Europe has to unite against the threat of Japan. And sure enough, Japan beat Russia in the Sino-Japanese War in 1904, sort of realizing yellow peril fears. So that's the stereotype. This stereotype, this fear of Asians, was also used and invoked in the United States time and time again. When Chinese first came to the United States, they were sort of welcomed, but quite quickly they were perceived as outsiders, threats, stealing white workers' jobs, pagan heathens who were unassimilable, and especially workers who would take cheap labor, who were coolies, who were unfree labor. So in the United States in the 19th century, this is the yellow peril stereotype of Asians. They were seen as especially racialized, disease-ridden bodies. And you can see here in this picture, the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were seen as specters of death emanating out of San Francisco Chinatown. Because this was such a strong stereotype of the yellow peril, Congress then passed the 1882 Chinese exclusion law, justifying exclusion with this stereotype that, again, that we as Asians were threats to the nation's public health. This stereotype, though, the exclusion of Chinese because of fear of being disease-ridden, didn't actually quell violence against Chinese. People don't realize this, but 3 years after the 1882 Exclusion Act, there was actually a period of what I call now the Yellow Terror. 168 communities of Chinese were actually forcibly mass dispossessed during that time. They were actually driven out by mob violence. And here you see what was a sign in Tacoma where 900 Chinese were driven out overnight. It was the first recorded case of racial trauma among Chinese. By arson, by mob violence, by fire, by lynching, Chinese were driven out again in 168 communities. This is a photo of a fire at Monterey. My great-grandparents settled in Monterey, California, right across from the aquarium. In the 1860s, they raised a family, built a thriving business, had homes. But when the Chinese townspeople wanted them out, the landlord evicted the Chinese. And when the Chinese wouldn't go, a mysterious fire burned down the entire village. And looters came and people cheered to see the Chinese village burnt down. My great-grandparents, again, who lived there for almost half a century, saw their entire life burned overnight, and they had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of safety against the racism. So because of the yellow peril, we were excluded, mass dispossessed. And then in 1900, another disease came, the bubonic plague. And again, Chinese were blamed for it. It was found in Chinatown. So health officials segregated the area, they allowed whites to leave, and they kept Chinese there with ropes, barbed wire, and armed guards. Santa Ana and Honolulu Chinatowns were burned down by health officials, leaving thousands homeless. So this headline reads that the bubonic plague has eerie parallels to today. Again, a disease comes, the yellow peril gets invoked, Chinese get blamed, and they face racist violence and racist policies. This connection of the yellow peril, race, and health policy continued at Angel Island, the immigration center in the 1920s. When migrants came from Europe, they landed at Ellis Island and they were processed within 2 to 3 hours and allowed to disembark. Chinese, on the other hand, and other Asians, because we were perceived, again, as being disease-ridden, actually were mass detained on average for 2 to 3 weeks. And again, were in locked barracks and under armed guards. Asians had to go through severe medical checks, and it was especially shaming for Chinese to be stripped naked before white men, doctors. Because we were seen as illegal aliens, we had to go through severe interrogations. So my grandparents had to answer 56 questions correctly in alignment with one another, or else my grandmother would have been deported. 5% of the Chinese who spent their life's fortunes to come and take the 3-week journey to California never made it. They were deported back because of arbitrary health reasons. And so even today, you can see the poetry inscribed on Angel Island walls where Chinese expressed the abuses they faced. In the 1940s, you can again see the connection between the yellow peril, health policy, and racism. Chinese and Latinos were more likely to get the epidemic of tuberculosis. But it wasn't because we were genetically predisposed, but it was because of environmental racism. Because of segregation, Chinese and Latinos were kept in more segregated, squalid, and crowded conditions. And so tuberculosis was more easily caught. Both sides of my family actually got tuberculosis. I even had it as a kid. And the policy, the health policy back then was that those with TB were sent to county sanatoriums and children were separated from adults in different wards. So again, both sides of my family, my aunts and my uncles and my mom, faced long-term family separation because of this disease. And of course, today you see that connection. Because Asians are blamed for COVID-19, we're facing a surge of racism and we're facing a surge of xenophobic policies that I'll sort of elaborate on. So this yellow peril fear that Asians are outsiders, that they're foreigners, has other dimensions besides this notion that we're disease-ridden. So that was the past, the fear of being disease-ridden, but there's other aspects of why we're the yellow peril that I want to talk about. That's really distinct about the racism against Asians. And as you can see in this picture with the octopus, there's many dimensions of the yellow peril. There's a racial threat, there's an economic threat, there's a political threat, there's a military threat, there's a cultural threat that I'm going to sort of quickly review. But overall, my thesis is that US-China foreign policy today, it translates directly into Asian American domestic race relations policy. So for us as Asians, US-Asian international relations impacts Asian American race relations. Correspondingly, the China bashing that you see so often today leads to the bashing of Chinese in the US and those who look like them. And we've actually have statistical evidence that finds a correlation that if people think of China as a threat, then they think of Chinese people. If they think of Chinese government as a threat, they then extend that to Chinese people, and they extend that negative view of Chinese people to Asians in America. So you can look up this article about that. So let me quickly go over how Asians are racialized with the yellow peril today. Quickly, we're seen as a racial threat. So now if you could read this, the racial threat is that there's an assumption and ideology that America should be a white Christian nation and therefore we don't belong. So now if you could read this for people.
Sure. Roommate told me that the Chinese are filthy people who all deserve to die of COVID-19. and said it is no wonder all plagues spread from China. Said that the Chinese were selfish and horribly overpopulated, and they should have issued a zero-child policy so they could not proliferate.
Thanks. So here, again, this is an incident where someone was harassed and reported to Stop API Hate. Here, the notion, the stereotype is that Asia, with its hordes of people, with a proliferation of population, would come like the Huns and overwhelm the West. So that's one aspect. Primarily, now China is seen as a military threat. And again, the Department of Defense named China as America's top concern, even though Russia invaded the Ukraine. So Derek, can you read this incident from Stop API Hate?
A man right outside the main Massachusetts General Hospital entrance yelled at me, "Why are you Chinese people killing everyone? What is wrong with you? Why the F are you killing us?"
So even now with the balloons, constantly everything is considered a military intelligence threat. And then even Asian American elected officials are being accused as being spies for the PRC. Because China is seen as communist, and because it has a different political system, there's a huge Cold War going on. So Juliana, could you read this quote?
While I was at the grocery store, another patron referred to me as another one of those damn Chinese trying to infect everyone into communism. Right.
So because communism is seen as the polar opposite to American democratic ideals, because communists have their own stereotypes, China is seen as a political threat. Clearly, China is also seen as an economic threat. Trade bills, again, Congress is trying to pass several trade bills, not only because there's a huge trade imbalance, but those trade imbalances lead to the outsourcing of work and the loss of American jobs. So now can you read this incident?
I received the following voicemail message. I just wanted to let you know that China has lost their best customer, America. Everybody in America is not going to buy Chinese anymore, so I hope that your country struggles and everybody has no money. I think it's pretty ignorant for your government not to protect that virus, to let that virus come out and ruin the world. Thanks, China.
So again, we have what we call now techno-Orientalism, where again, the East is seen as the opposite of the West, but rather than the East being seen as inferior, techno-Orientalism is a fear that Asians are better with technology, that they're going to steal the best of American technology and make it better, the way maybe Asian countries do with phones and other devices. And finally, we're the cultural threat. Again, because we have exotic habits or habits that are different from the West, that's the source of COVID. And so, Derek, can you read this last quote?
I was in line at the pharmacy when a woman approached me and sprayed Lysol all over me. She was yelling, "You're the infection. Go home. We don't want you here." I was in shock and cried as I left the building. No one came to my help.
So in this case, someone sprayed Lysol on an Asian, and this isn't isolated. We had several cases where people sprayed us. So we're not only seen as being infected, we as Asians are seen as being the actual infection, that our bodies themselves sort of defile America's white nationhood because we're contrary to its Christian ideologies, because we're different with our cultural habits. So in all these ways, you could see we're depicted as a threat. And because we're seen as threatening, we're seen as outsiders who don't belong, we're threats to be excluded. And here you see the racialization of Asian Americans. We're racialized differently than African Americans because we're more racialized whether we're insiders to the US or outsiders. Sometimes we're insiders, we're the model minority, we're crazy rich Asians, we're Olympic champions who are favored. But clearly, that status is really conditional. Suni Lee won the gold medal, but when she returned to America, she actually was pepper sprayed and told to go back home. In times of war like World War II or after 9/11 with Islamophobia, in times of economic downturn when Vincent Chin was killed, being mistaken for a Japanese person, and in times of pandemic, Asians are more depicted and especially racialized as outsiders, as a yellow peril to be excluded and kept out. And so we're especially feared. And that racialization of Asian Americans as outsider leads to different forms of discrimination. It's a different sort of understanding because Asians in America are often lumped with Asia. That's probably different than, let's say, African Americans who aren't often associated with Africa, or Russians, Americans associated with Russia. So if the US is at war with any Asian nation, Japan, Vietnam, Korea, at war in Pakistan, then we're also seen as the enemy. This racialization quickly has lots of impacts, and I'll quickly go through them. In terms of mental health, 2/3 of us experience negative mental health because of the racial trauma. Oh, by the way, I'm calling this a period of collective racial trauma. 1 in 5 of us have experienced this type of racism that you heard in the incidents, and 1 of 5 of us who experience racism have higher rates of distress, hypervigilance, and even avoidance of places. So we're not even going out because of this racism. Over 50 studies have been done already in the last 3 years to demonstrate the impact of racism on our mental health on all ages. And here's a staggering stat. When asked what's their greatest source of stress during the pandemic, Asians said racism. So think about that. Asians are more afraid of other Americans' hate than they are of a pandemic that's killed 1 million people. We've had economic impacts because of the racism. Asian businesses, their profits dropped 60% during the pandemic, 5 times more than other American businesses. Asian American businesses, because of racism, were avoided. People thought they could catch COVID at Chinese restaurants. And so they shut down earlier. And so as a result, large swaths of the Asian American working class have had to file for unemployment. And as in the past, not only were we met with interpersonal violence, but we were met with yellow peril exclusionary policies, just like the Chinese Exclusion Act. During the Trump administration, he banned Chinese scientists and researchers. He extended the Muslim ban. He cut refugee resettlement. He cut H-1B visas. He then suspended migration visas overall so that families couldn't reunite. All these policies disproportionately hurt Asians and, again, saw us as threats to the nation's national security, public health, and well-being. So you could see this yellow peril stereotype has been extensive. It impacts the racism we're experiencing. And to wrap up, I just want to make 2 points about how we need to change this yellow peril stereotype. The first point is that the yellow peril stereotype has been institutionalized. You could see it in these policies. You could see it in the rhetoric of politicians. You could see it in the in how China is being portrayed by media and other institutes and corporations. So what we need to do is to have policy change. Since racism has been institutionalized, we need to change those policies. I think it's okay to criticize the People's Republic of China and its policies, but we shouldn't extend that animosity, that fear towards Chinese people or Chinese and Asians in the US. And clear policy directives that make that distinction is really needed at this moment. And finally, you could see in this photo, this is actually a cartoon from the 19th century when Russia was about to exclude Jewish people. And Uncle Sam was going to protest Russia's exclusion of Jews. But there was a skeleton in America's closet. It was the exclusion of Chinese that popped out at Uncle Sam. I think we need narrative change about the Yellow Peril. You know, I talked about how Orientalism is how the US and the West views itself as progressive, modern, normal. But the Yellow Peril isn't just about how America views itself. The Yellow Peril is about how America feels about itself. The Yellow Peril isn't about how Americans feel about Asia. The Yellow Peril speaks more to how America feels about its own status now. The Yellow Peril speaks more to how America has internal insecurities about its status in the world, about America's hegemony militarily, about America's economic standing, about America's insecurity over its cultural standing. So what we need to do is rethink America's standing in the world, not to change, not to fight so that Asian Americans belong, but rethink America as a nation that belongs in a family and brotherhood of nations that treats others with respect and dignity. So thanks a lot for listening to me, and I look forward to the question and answer time.
Thank you very much, Russell. That was very interesting, very fantastic. Appreciate your presentation. And again, thank you to the students who were able to read those quotes. We appreciate you joining in. Folks, please do put in your questions in the chat or raise your emoji hand, and we will call on you and you can ask your questions to Dr. Russell Jeung. While that's happening, can you fill me in and those here on what's going on today with Stop AAPI and what is the latest work and what you all do with the research and the information collected, what was reported?
Yeah, so I no longer work with Stop AAPI Hate, but they're trying to do the policy change work, address the harassment we're experiencing. Most of the racism isn't in the form of hate crimes, but in form of hate incidents, verbal harassment, shunning, civil rights violations. So they have some anti-harassment bills. You know, a lot of it happens on public transit when we're in crowded conditions. So they're dealing with, in California, promoting bills to address harassment on public transit. I'm going in 2 weeks to the US Commission on Civil Rights to say we need to extend civil rights laws and regulations. So in the 1960s, they passed public accommodations to help African Americans be able to get safe access to goods and services. Today, we need an extension of those Civil Rights Act bills. We need more safe access to goods and services. Asians aren't able to go shopping because we're getting harassed in these ways. And so we want to, again, have more enforcement of those public accommodation bills and actually extend it more to different states. So that's some of the policy work. I'm, again, writing a little bit more on the Yellow Peril. Again, I think it's the primary stereotype and representation that's shaping Americans and leading to the racism against us.
That's great. Thank you. Folks, please do drop your questions in the chat. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, yeah, and if we don't have any, then students could chime in and put their questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Russell, from your work and your experiences where you are today, where we are all today in the pandemic, what is the change then that you are working with your students on, that you are seeing happening in any communities, be it San Francisco or elsewhere? Are you seeing a difference of activities that give you hope in terms of changes that you would like to see and that we need to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, what's again, the amount of racism is staggering. 1 out of 5 Asian Americans experience racism translates to 5 million cases of hate in a year. So it's collective. It's racial because people aren't attacking individuals that they know. It's simply by the way we look that we're getting attacked. And it's traumatizing. So again, those who face racism have 3 or more symptoms of issues like avoidance of places, hypervigilance where they're worried about going anywhere, depression, anger. And this type of trauma gets passed down intergenerationally. So I'm arguing this is a period like Japanese American incarceration, in that an entire community is impacted and it gets passed down generationally. But what's been heartening in the face of this collective racial trauma is that the community really has stood up. I've really seen, probably in my lifetime, the largest Asian American movement ever. It's like the 3rd wave of the Asian American movement. The first was in the 60s, maybe another wave after Vincent Chin was killed in 1982. But this wave really has been more pan-ethnic, so that South Asians and Southeast Asians are really aligning with East Asians. It's been more multi-generational. So elders and young people are really coming together. You don't think of Asian elders complaining about racism, but they're reporting in proportion to their representation in the community. They're going online because they want the racism to stop. And I see the movement go across different businesses, corporations, Hollywood, faith-based organizations. A lot of different institutions are addressing this. So I've been really hopeful. Again, the Smithsonian has had several sessions and have really addressed it in the museum, have been teaching about it. Mm-hmm. So for me, addressing it with education has been the primary way to combat racism and to change the narrative. There's a huge movement to introduce Asian American studies K through 12. Again, the Asian American staff at the Smithsonian have been leading that. I've gone to conferences where Smithsonian staff have really curated resources and curriculum for teachers. And so I think that's probably the best way to address the racism.
That's great. We have 2 questions, and I'm sure our colleagues from across the Smithsonian thank you for the accolades. Our colleague Nigel brings it back to just what you're saying. Are museum programs and exhibitions effective in blunting prejudicial attitudes and behaviors? If you want to just elaborate a little bit more, Russell, that would be great. And then we'll go to Megan's question next. Please keep adding more questions.
So first of all, if you go to the Smithsonian and you're in the nation's capital and you're at the corridor or the gallery, I don't know what it's called, but to have an African American museum, that just shows there's a place in our nation's capital and in our nation and in our nation's history where African Americans belong, are seen, are recognized, and commemorated. And I think in the same way, developing an Asian American museum would have that same impact, shifting from being the yellow peril outsiders, but no, really belonging, getting official institutional recognition of our history, of our voices, of our literature. So museum programs have been shown to be effective in addressing prejudicial attitudes and behaviors, especially the way museums are designed now, interactive, and actually those compelling questions. That's what I see the Smithsonian doing is in its exhibit, it asks the compelling question: who belongs, who deserves rights, who can vote. And those compelling questions that are posed in these exhibitions really make people think and make people interact. And so it also enables, just one last point, what I really appreciate about museums and the Smithsonian in particular is that it promotes empathy. You enter into an exhibit and you're able to take a different person's point of view. You get to see their lifestyle, the objects that they use. And I think that sort of interactive educational experience is probably the best way to address prejudicial attitudes.
That's great. We have one more on this theme before we talk a little bit more about AAPI topics. This is a question from Megan Smith. What would you like to see museums do to be anti-racist? Any specifics?
Yeah, besides, hosting exhibits, I think, again, how you showcase the exhibits, how you write about them, how you center maybe marginalized populations' perspectives, again, is really helpful because, like, for example, American history is seen from a whole bunch of different, you can understand history from a whole bunch of different angles, but how do you help people see things from an Asian American sense? So maybe we face mass dispossession, right, as Chinese. How do we know what it feels like to be mass dispossessed? And so what I would like museums to do to be anti-racist is to center on the experiences of those groups that are being exhibited so that people could get to be able to put themselves into other people's shoes and understand what it's like to be mass dispossessed or to be shunned for being disease carrying.
That's great. Thank you. The empathy. Our colleague Catherine Ott asks, what kinds of intergenerational differences are there about AAPI politics? Great question, Catherine.
Yeah, there are, again, the Asian American community isn't a monolith. There's lots of ethnicities, lots of generations, lots of languages and religions. Basically, again, American-born Asians usually are able to access universities, get more socialized into American norms and behaviors. So, and so that's why overall, Asian American, those born in the U.S. are more liberal, politically, are more integrated into different workplaces and in different neighborhoods, whereas older generations, I think, may be more conservative. If they're fleeing communist states, they're probably more anti-communist, and then they hold more conservative moral and cultural values for the first generation. But then later generations, you see a real shift. So my class here, they're all studying about the differences between the immigrant and second generation and how stark the differences are.
That's great. Our colleague asks, to what degree are certain politicians' behaviors a symptom of rising AAPI hate versus a cause?
Yeah, it's both and, right? And so it's both, it's clearly a cause. I think people would have been afraid of COVID-19 and blame Asians, but political rhetoric that actually used the term Chinese virus really was deadly, because that term racialized a virus. It made just a biological virus a Chinese one, and it made Chinese people the disease carriers. It was the Chinese were the virus and the virus was Chinese. That became people's implicit bias. That became our schema by which we saw Asian people and our schema by which we saw the disease. And so I think that it's clear there's a correlation between the use of President Trump's usage of the term, and we saw that go viral over social media, and those who use that term versus COVID-19 had a lot more anti-Asian sentiment. So in that way, the political rhetoric was a catalyst for racism. It was really, really significant. This racism against Asians is global. And when I talk to people in Australia, in Canada, they say they've experienced the same type of racism, of harassment, of assaults. But when I asked them, well, what's fomenting it? They said President Trump's term Chinese virus. So even in other nations, they recognize that when you hear political rhetoric that's inflammatory and xenophobic, that then normalizes the hate. That then sanctions the hate, right? So it's both and. It's clearly, maybe politicians are already fearful. Maybe they have good reason to be concerned about COVID-19. But again, historically in the past, and even today, I argue that political rhetoric may not be the first cause, but a major cause in contributing to the racism.
Yeah, so interesting. I want to go back to your one slide. I found it, in your comments, just it's hard to kind of not think about, which is one thing to be concerned about the pandemic and your health, but then to really be struck with also the fear of racial prejudice. And that's that dichotomy I find to be just so, this one. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that and what's going on and what is being done right now to and for mental health in the Asian communities in the wake of this.
Yeah, so again, I think Asians are the racial groups suffering the most from pandemic. Not only were we anxious and fearful about the disease, we're more fearful about our elders or young people catching the disease, because we have that collectivist orientation that we're not worried about ourselves, but we're worried about our families and our elders. We're worried about the economics of the pandemic. Again, it's going to take Asians longer to recover from the depression, from the recession, because those in ethnic markets, economies take longer. And then we're anxious because of racism. And so again, all these studies, again, over 50 studies now have demonstrated that clear relationship between racism and post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so, but the issue is that Asian Americans generally don't access mental health. They don't seek individual therapy, which is a very Western model for healing. And so to address Asian American community mental health, we really have to come up with new policies and new approaches to help people's concerns. Just for example, just to show the concern, at San Francisco State, we had an anti-Asian hate forum during finals week, and we got over 150 students showing up. This is during finals, and when students are really, hard pressed for time, but they were, again, more concerned about the racism, that they needed to come together to find support and healing from each other to address this mental health concern. So I think young people are really aware of their mental health status, but we have to figure out, and then, we've also had a lot of mass shootings that have been traumatic, in Monterey Park, Half Moon Bay. And so I think we need to, policy-wise, ensure that there's language access for our community to mental health professionals, and then that mental health professionals get out into the community where people are, because they're not going to go to a mental health clinic. So we need to go to them to provide services, to provide trauma-informed care.
That's great. More questions for our guest today, please.
Yeah, so we need, while we're waiting, we need alternative mental health forms. Interestingly, so I'm giving a lot of talks on mental health now. And interestingly, young people experience more trauma when facing racism than elders. Right, so they experience the same situation, yet elders seem to be more resilient to racism than young people. Young people are super disappointed that they faced racism, they're angry, they feel more depression, they feel more anger. And it could be that our elders may not just be so attuned to their emotional trauma state, right? That could be one thing. Because, really Asians don't distinguish between mental health and health. But the second reason why I think our elders may be more resilient or not have as much trauma is that they have more protective factors from their background, that they've come from long periods of trauma, of war, poverty, migration. So they've experienced it in the past, and they maybe have more cultural traditions and religious coping mechanisms like karma, like prayer, like meditation, that give them strength. I also think their expectations are different, that Asian Americans expect everything to be equal, to people be happy, whereas maybe our elders realize the inequality of societies and they are more expectant of suffering. So it's really interesting to see, someone asked, what are the generational differences? Our elders have a lot to teach us about how to deal with trauma because they've gone through it in the past. And so I'm really pushing for, again, in terms of community mental health, we have to, instead of telling our elders, you need therapy, you need to go to a mental health clinic, I'm actually trying to reverse it and say, What can we learn from our elders who've already gone through so much trauma in their lifetimes? What resources, what traditions, what worldviews do they have? What coping mechanisms do they employ that we younger people, and I'm in the middle, that younger people can learn from our elders? And so there's a lot of cultural wealth in our community, and I think we have to access it. Yeah, it's interesting diving into the mental health.
Yeah.
There's this great program called BOBA, Building on Bonds Authentically, that's trying to get high schoolers talking to their Asian parents about racism and sparking, the race talk that a lot of African American families have. And it's interesting, again, that intergenerational dialogue that needs to be done so that we can learn from each other. So that's just one of the initiatives that's started.
That's fantastic. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about some of the outcomes of the conversations at SF State, and are you seeing those kind of forums as important in terms of younger folks and students and their kind of abilities to grapple what's going on, and also to make the changes that you alluded to earlier with such things as kind of working with state and school boards and other things that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think any sort of grouping, affinity groups, we really advocate that just so that you could come together and share experience and to not feel so isolated, to recognize that your feelings of maybe fear or anxiety are legitimate, to recognize that other Asians are also being threatened, or you're not the only one being called out and attacked. So just coming together provides, some emotional support and social support. But beyond that, I think coming together in groupings like at San Francisco State, some of that fear and anger then gets translated into action. We found that if you're isolated and you just feel these things, then you, again, have higher rates of depression and anger because you're suffering alone. When you come together in these groupings like we hold at San Francisco State, then you don't feel so isolated. Those symptoms lessen because you have social support. But if you're able to be in a group and then take action, then those people feel a lot better. They're able to translate their anger and fear into action and use their emotional pain into something positive. So there's a concept called post-traumatic resilience, where you bounce back, but there's an additional new concept called post-traumatic growth, where not only do you bounce back from the pain, but you actually grow from the racism and the pain. So post-traumatic growth is this idea that you experience trauma, a racist attack, you come together, you learn from it, and not only do you bounce back, but you come out stronger. You come back more appreciative of life. You come back more empathetic about, like, if we as Asians experience racism, now I can understand how African Americans are racially profiled and get mass incarcerated. I can understand how Latinos are racially profiled and face family separation. I can understand how Muslims may be racially profiled and face mass bans. We then develop greater empathy, right? And then not only do we have greater appreciation for life, have more empathy, but then we have maybe more purpose. We want to make change. And that post-traumatic growth is what I see happening on campuses, even among our elders, that Asian Americans now are taking what is this really negative, dark period of being the yellow peril to making it a time of healing, a time of renewal. So that's pretty powerful, and that's hopeful for me, is that we could go from experiencing collective racial trauma to having collective racial growth.
You see that which is beautiful, and I'm glad that there is that silver lining for you after working so hard with Stop AAPI and all that work to see all that data. Do you see this as the next movement of projects like Stop AAPI and the work that's happening all across the country into this next iteration, this next chapter, this positive evolution where this is happening, in addition to the other work that you've talked about?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, translating fear and pain, we know that when people report to Stop AAPI Hate, that lessens their trauma symptoms compared to people who don't report. We know that because by reporting to Stop AAPI Hate, they have a platform of expression. They're developing a collective voice. They actually, in our surveys, said they reported to develop that collective voice. And so again, if you report to Stop AAPI Hate and join a group, that actually helps the trauma. But again, and then translating trauma into action, I think that's what people are doing in different ways. Some help elders, some do more political action, but I think just again, taking action is really helpful. And so I think that's what's going on, is this is a period for the Asian American community to grow, not only be aware of our issues, but actually, again, learn from our cultural wealth, learn from our elders, and then help not only fight for justice for ourselves, but fight for racial justice for our nation. You know, I know a lot of Japanese Americans are fighting for African American reparations now because we've learned and grown from our experiences.
Yeah. I'll give a moment here to see if anybody has a final question or two before we start wrapping up this this very interesting hour with our guest speaker.
Oh, just for Smithsonian people as we wrap up. So we've done we at San Francisco State have done a series of videos with elders who experience racism. They talk about the trauma. One guy was actually slashed on the subway. Another person was stalked by a truck for blocks where the driver was hurling racial epithets, and she didn't go out for 3 months afterwards. So these elders have experienced racism, but then they use their religious coping, their prayer, their chanting, their meditation. They use their communal support, gaining fellowship, going to church, to not only be able to forgive their perpetrators, but also empathize with them and then seek social change. So we have a series of videos, and what we want to do at San Francisco State is share those videos and have, just like the Bobo Project paired up kids to talk to their parents, we want to pair up young people to talk to their grandparents about this and to see what can we learn from the cultural wealth of our elders, and then how we could support our elders as they're particularly fearful during this time.
Great. Please do share it with me, and I'll make sure to include links to those projects along with this video and information on Stop AAPI and other information that Russell would like to share out. Those all sound very interesting. I think I'll use this as a moment to, again, thank you for today's talk and for walking those on the program today through the story and the history, which is, you did such a great job to help us get there, and also on understanding this impact to the AAPI community. I want to thank you again for your presentation, and I think those who were able to join today's presentation. So thank you very much. And students, thank you for joining us as well.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Thanks, Smithsonian. Oh yeah, I testified for the Asian American Smithsonian. It's a, what do you call it? It's the grant to explore developing an Asian American museum.
Well, thank you for doing so. And on that note, we will end today's program.